from the Mutual Broadcasting System. This is STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. Now, retired Marine Intelligence Officer and globally recognized risk expert Hal Kempfer.
Welcome to another discussion of STRAT, a little strategic risk assessment talk. And I have to tell you, it's been an amazing week. If I could just, before I start off with anything else, we all understand that there's a certain incumbent risk with aviation, flying, stuff like that. But this last week, we saw, just a few days ago, we saw this horrendous mishap that took place right next to Reagan National Airport in Washington, D.C. over the Potomac. A military helicopter striking or colliding, if you will, with a civilian regional jet. And, of course, tremendous loss of life. I think it was about 64 people were killed. It might be more than that. I'm not sure if I include the military in that. And they're trying to figure out what exactly it is. But it does bring to fore an issue that certainly I've talked about, and certainly what Mark Mansfield and I talked about, which was basically assessing strategic risk early on and taking proper mitigative measures to protect it. As more is coming out, apparently these near misses between helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft near Reagan National Airport was an annual event. This was not an unusual thing, and I have flown out of Reagan many times. I can't say that I've flown in a helicopter along the Potomac right there, but I certainly have flown in helicopters in Northern Virginia, not too far from that same area. And there's just a lot of air traffic right there. It's, right across the water from the Washington Mall. So it is one of those things where I think as we get into this, we're going to find out some very significant errors were made. People didn't really assess the risk as much as just ignored it. And I think this might get into a variety of different things. I think it could get into the flight profile of, if you will, of the helicopter. I think it might be the how they were communicating. And obviously there was some confusion with the helicopter as to where the civilian airliner was. That could have been tied to the fact they just changed runways. So the airliner had moved to a different runway, and maybe they were looking at an airliner on the previous assigned runway. Who knows? Who knows what exactly is going on? We will find out more about this, but I do think that somewhere you're going to find somebody failed to pay heed to what was going on at that airport, and they decide to basically take some shortcuts with the idea that that eventual day of reckoning would never come, and it came. So I just want to point this out because we just saw the same thing or a similar thing, and I talked about it with the LA fires, where there was a lot of things in there that coulda, woulda, shoulda been done before. They could have dramatically mitigated those fires. I'm not saying you can prevent those fires, but what I will say is that every disaster, man-made or natural, can be mitigated. In some cases, they can be outright prevented by proper early measures and things like that. Early warning can save lives, evacuation, all sorts of stuff. So I think we're going to find out that, and obviously there's no evacuation from aircraft, but I'm just saying we're going to find out that there were some decisions made which may seem rather mundane that had truly catastrophic impact. So with that said, I just want to say it because that has been such a big issue. I had the mishap that occurred over the Potomac, and then just a couple days later, you had the aviation mishap that has occurred near Philadelphia, and it's got everybody staring at aviation. But I do think that when they get into the investigations, they're going to find a lot of things that coulda, shoulda, or would have been done that could have made a big difference, and that some just didn't really understand or properly assess the risk. And risk assessment is an enormous part. We talk about strategic risk assessment. That's what this whole podcast is about. It's a strategic part of what it is. So I just wanted to kind of say that right up front before I get into some of the international things. Interesting. Venezuela. And Venezuela's been somewhat of a fascinating country. They, under Hugo Chavez and certainly under the current dictator, I'm not going to call him an elected president or anything like that because he's not. He was not lawfully elected. In fact, 2/3, as near as we can figure, 2/3 of the vote actually went for his opponent. So he was not elected. He is simply a strongman, if you will, being held into power by bribing the military and security forces to keep him in power. But Hugo Chavez has been just a troublemaker. He's aligned with, countries that are trying to cause issues with the U.S. around the world, and he's just a pain. Under the Biden administration, there was a short reprieve. We wanted to get some of our U.S. citizens who are being held essentially hostage by Venezuela. We wanted to get them back, and so we allowed Chevron to continue its oil operations in Venezuela, and that appears to be still in place. That the Trump administration, there have been some talk that the Trump administration may shut that whole thing down. It certainly have an impact on Chevron. It'd have an impact on oil prices to a certain extent, not a huge amount, but it looks like that's not going to happen. Rick Grenell, the former first Trump administration ambassador to Germany, who was also the acting director of national intelligence, met on Friday, January 31st, with Nicolas Maduro. It seemed an odd meeting. It was kind of, everyone was scratching their head. Why would you bother sending a high-level envoy? At this point, I think the Trump administration's been around for 11 days or something at that point. Why would you set up a meeting like this? And of course, the concern would be that we're adding legitimacy to Maduro's illegitimate regime, if you will, simply by meeting with him. But the other fear was that we might pull back on our recognition of Edmundo Gonzalez as the rightfully elected president of Venezuela. But as of now, that doesn't appear to have been what happened. There was a high-level meeting. Now, some of this had been pre-negotiated before Grenell went down there. 6 Americans are being held down there, were immediately released. And on the plane with Grenell as he was flying back to the U.S., doing photo op stuff that they were, posting and putting out there on social media. And while the meeting was certainly, a lot of concern to be counterproductive in some ways strategically, set us back in terms of what we're trying to accomplish in the region, or maybe just turn out to be a big nothing burger, if you will, where nothing is accomplished. It actually did produce something of value. Not only are the 6 that are with Grenell coming back, there's apparently 10 that are coming back a little bit later, and we've gotten Venezuela to agree to take at least criminal Venezuela citizens who are illegal aliens, undocumented aliens, if you will, in the United States. And previously Venezuela was like, we're not going to take it back, whatever it is. One of the interesting statistics about Venezuela is just how much of the population has left and is continuing to leave. That's one of the reasons I think that that certainly the Trump administration and the Biden administration was focused on Venezuela, but with the Trump administration's big centerpiece being illegal immigration, border security, I'm not surprised they put more emphasis on this. That about 8 million of Venezuela's population have left in recent years, basically out of frustration with everything tied to the Maduro administration, to include, or regime, I should say, and to include the desperate economic situation, not to mention the political repression that occurs within Venezuela under Maduro. 8 million of a population that most recent poll or most recent census data, if you will, has it about 29 million. So a 29 million person country, they have 8 million people leave. That is a lot of people, a lot of Venezuelans that have left. And when they leave, they've only got so many different places to go. Yes, they went to neighboring countries around South America. Some are in Guyana, went down to Brazil, some have gone over to Colombia. So that has all taken place. All right. But for those that really want to leave, the place to go is the United States. And that's where they've been heading to. Apparently, a lot of criminal gangsters have been headed up to the United States and going into business in the U.S. And those are the ones that we want to send back down there immediately. But it is huge. One of the interesting things with despots is that they obviously are repressing their people, but to a certain extent, they create a situation where they really are almost encouraging those who disagree with them to flee, to leave. And what that does is it further secures their own situation by getting those who would be potential opponents to the regime out of the country. And that there is probably a critical mass formula in there somewhere that if you get too many people leaving, you're taking away the essential foundations of what would be needed to overthrow that regime at some point. And I think that's probably what we're kind of seeing. We had great hopes that, in the last year or two that something would be reversed here, that the Maduro regime would be thrown out of office, and it just hasn't happened. And when it fails, you see another huge surge of Venezuelans leaving Venezuela, many of them, maybe most of them, trying to make their way to the United States. And so that becomes a release valve for a despotic, repressive regime, an anti-U.S., in this case, anti-Western regime as well. So there is a larger issue that we have to address, which is putting basically, I'm not saying halt immigration, but putting some sort of deterrence on immigration as being a political release valve for repressive regimes, certainly in the Western Hemisphere, at the very least, because we don't want to see the Maduro regime existing for any longer than it is in Venezuela. We would like to see the Venezuelan people find some way to get rid of that regime. I'm not saying we're advocating for civil war or something like that, but find some way to do that. And by being a release valve for the economic desperate straits from the repressive Maduro regime, I think that it creates a larger, longer-term problem for the U.S., and I think that's something we're going to have to take a look at. Now, with that said, we're not changing our policy there. What did Maduro get out of this? Right now, all I can see is he got a very high-level photo op, if you will, with an envoy from President Trump. I don't know what else was negotiated. That's been a bit of speculation. What are the deals? The White House is saying there were no other deals beyond what I've spoken of so far. But certainly other countries in the region are looking at this. And of course, this falls right on the heels of what just occurred in Colombia, which was Colombia said that they weren't going to take back the illegal or undocumented illegal aliens in the U.S. being deported from the U.S. down to Colombia because we were sending them on military aircraft. And they found that very offensive. The president down there found that very offensive that this was going on and said, nope, we're not going to do it. I'm going to stop it. And President Trump immediately said, okay, fine. I'm going to immediately impose a 25% tariff on all Colombian goods. And if it's not resolved in a week, that's going to jump to a 50% tariff. Initially, the Colombian president came back with some very harsh rhetoric as far as, well, we're not going to take that and blah, blah, blah. And it was amazing how quickly that turned around, because I think probably somebody on the economic side explained to him what the full implications were of those tariffs and what that would do to the Colombian economy. And I have to tell you, it was one of the fastest changes I ever saw, that within hours it went from, well, we're not going to take that from the United States to, okay, I'm going to send the presidential jet to the U.S. to pick up our citizens to bring them back to Colombia. And apparently, from what I have read, the military airlift of Colombian citizens back to Colombia is back on track. So it was fascinating what was done there. It was a very quick turnaround. I'm looking at that. I'm looking at just what happened in Venezuela, and I'm kind of wondering the impact it's going to have on other countries in Central and South America and in the Caribbean in terms of how they interface with the U.S., not just on immigration, but on a host of other issues as well. And of course, I'm not going to get into it in this podcast, but we have that ongoing issue. Our new Secretary of State, Rubio, is actually in Panama talking to the President of Panama about the canal, about Chinese influence in and around the canal, on each end of the canal. And of course, with the President Trump, talking about actually trying to get the canal back in U.S. hands. It is just, I got to tell you, for years, Central South America, which is under U.S. Southern Command, certainly in the military parlance, was often called the forgotten area of responsibility, the forgotten COCOM, if you will. While everybody was focused on the Indo-Pacific or what was happening with Ukraine and Europe or what was happening in Africa with various different civil wars and other things happening. And of course, the big focus that's been forever, it seems, on the Middle East. Basically, they were kind of falling off the shelf in terms of resources and attention, and that may be changing. That may be changing very quickly. So we'll see. Another thing happening this week is, and I'm recording this on Saturday, February 1st, just for reference, but the U.S. imposed 25% tariffs on goods coming from Mexico and Canada and 10% tariff on goods coming from China. Now, I find this to be fascinating. In my somewhat Byzantine career, I've been assigned as a military intelligence officer, an analyst, if you will, working with U.S. Customs for quite some time. I actually spent some time doing what they call regulatory audit, looking for trade fraud for tariff purposes with U.S. Customs, looking at basically fraud in terms of bringing in valuation of what's coming in. So I kind of have a little bit more knowledge of this than probably most in terms of what this is. Tariffs had kind of disappeared. During the 90s, certainly at the end of the Cold War, free trade, free trade, free trade. And that was the mantra. And as someone who went to a school that it was basically international business graduate school that was focused on international trade, international finance, certainly the mantra that came from that it's almost a religious belief in the value of free trade around the world, and that borders that see a lot of trade seldom see war. All right, well, I don't know if that's entirely true anymore. It was brought up with many of the more recent wars that whole mantra seemed to have fallen apart. But this is very interesting that the tariffs are being imposed in such a way. I am anticipating some very quick reactions as the full economic scope of what's being done really settles in both Canada and Mexico in terms of what this will mean. There also might be some exceptions made, for example, with the highly integrated automobile industry, especially in Canada, but also significantly in Mexico. So I'm not saying that this is a done deal yet. I mean, the tariff may go in, but we have seen how quickly these things seem to move under the Trump administration. Now, what this goes in the face of is the concept of a comparative advantage. And that really goes back to, and certainly everyone knows I love to quote 19th century economic theorists, but the famous British economist David Ricardo, that basically talked about the benefits of basically trade, if you will, of international trade. And talking about opportunity costs in terms of, if you're a more northern state that grows a lot of apples, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for you to try and use a lot of resources, hothouses, whatever, to try and do tropical fruits. Whereas if you're a more southern state that has a lot of tropical fruits, citrus, whatever, doesn't make a lot of sense for you to try and grow apples where that doesn't fit. So the idea is trade apples for oranges or apples for whatever comes there, and that each country has a comparative advantage in terms of what they grow, what they produce, whatever it is. And by trade, each country gets a lot more value than by trying to waste a lot of resources producing stuff where it's not economically efficient for them to do so. Okay, well, that was always the mantra of world trade. The other part of that, though, is global conflict and the potential of war or something short of war that can interrupt that foundation, if you will, of global trade. And that's what we're dealing with right now, not with Mexico and Canada, but certainly with China as our main peer competitor, if you will, in the world. The concern is being so dependent on China for key goods, key inputs to manufacturing a variety of things, particularly key minerals, metals and stuff that are used in a variety of things, high-tech things, but also used especially in things, not to say the Trump administration is excessively green, but there is a lot of technology out there dealing with batteries and stuff like that. Certainly lithium and lithium production, whether you're making the lithium hydroxide or carbonate or whatever, that we'd like to see that shifted back to the Western Hemisphere and preferably back to the United States. Ironically, the trade issue with Canada, we actually have a trade surplus with Canada. It's one of the few countries where we actually do. Can't say as much for Mexico. Mexico has done, as somebody who grew up as a farmer in California, I can tell you that free trade with Mexico has had a very disruptive effect. For example, avocados. Mexico has cheaper, better avocados, and I'm sure many in California go, well, they're not better, but they are cheaper. All right. And so the cost of avocados and certainly the cost of guacamole will go up with this tariff on Mexico. And also the maquiladoras all across northern Mexico, where these just amazing urban areas where you just see this massive manufacturing capability, all based on free trade across the border. They're going to be threatened. So you're going to see divestment coming out of this. You're going to see a lack of investment going both ways. And even when this is resolved, the fact that this was just that at some point is going to have a lasting reverberation in the marketplace, particularly with investors saying, do I really want to risk this big investment on setting up operations in Mexico if at some point in the future, Mexico's government decides they're not going to cooperate with the U.S. on immigration or something, and the Trump administration immediately slaps huge tariffs and my entire investment goes upside down? That will have, that potentiality is going to have a huge impact across the board. All right. Now, will this be inflationary? You can't raise the cost of imports without it having some inflationary effect. What it'll do, though, it'll also make U.S. produced goods more cost competitive with whatever was being imported. Although, because the free trade regime has been in place for so long, there are some things that we just don't produce at all or don't produce in substantial quantity that I don't see that evening out anytime soon. It's not like you can just turn a switch and U.S. production on something goes up to counteract the loss of bringing goods in from another country. So that's going to be a big issue. Also, the integration of things like automobiles. There's a tremendous amount of fully integrated automobile manufacturing industry between the U.S. and Canada. It's been there for decades and decades and decades. Same thing with Mexico. If you go down to Mexico, some of the more northern Mexico cities, you will find these vast manufacturing facilities for automobiles. They may not produce the entire automobile there, but they produce a lot of the automobile there. And that is based on that. Of course, one of the things that we've seen, too, in more recent years is China has gone in there to put production, basically doing maquiladora-type operations down there in order to circumvent getting their goods into the U.S. and paying any tariffs or potential fees that come with that. And I think that's some of the stuff that's in the background on this. So a lot of different things. Will this put pressure on China to influence Russia on trying to get them to the negotiating table to get a ceasefire in Ukraine? That is also something I have no doubt has been discussed extensively. I've seen it certainly referenced in the news quite a bit, that any pressure on China is an indirect way of putting pressure on Russia. And so that may be something. And of course, the other thing that President Trump has talked about is what he feels is what is the great trade imbalance with the European Union. And of course, the European Union, by its very design, is a link of countries that have essentially a preference, if not protectionist, if you will, arrangement between all the European Union countries to basically give them preferential treatment in trade. And that's just what the European Union is. That was basically what it was set up to be, European free trade, if you will, within Europe, but also to center that manufacturing and everything within Europe. And so, yes, there is a basic reality there in terms of how Europe is set up on this. And that's something that has been certainly voiced as being unfair. Now, is this a long-term thing or a short-term negotiation strategy? Well, we'll see what the U.S. does. We have a variety of things we want from Canada. We keep mentioning from both Canada and Mexico, we want them to do something about fentanyl. We want them to do something about illegal immigration. And let me just point out, yes, primarily when you talk about illegal border incursions, you're mostly focused on the southwest border with Mexico. However, if you look at the northern border, it is a huge border. It's much longer than our border with Mexico. But it is also extremely porous. I mean, as bad as the border is in the southwest, the border to the north is just wide open. Of course, countries realize that. China realizes that. China has people coming in to Canada, and then they find some way to get into the United States. They do the same thing out Mexico too. But so we've seen a lot of Chinese undocumented illegal immigration that's taken place in other countries around the world. And I'm sure if we got into some of it's Commonwealth countries, and Canada is part of the Commonwealth, and they make their way into Canada, and then they make their way into the United States. So there will be certainly border issues, immigration issues, fentanyl, and the phenomenal loss of life. Somewhere between 70 to 100,000 people, Americans, die every year from fentanyl overdoses. So all of this will be addressed. But I also think what we're going to see is we're going to get Mexico kind of policing up its own, if you will, on the border, setting up a regime at least on the Mexico-U.S. border, where instead of us putting a phenomenal amount of resources to stop this incursion, Mexico will put a lot of resources on the border to stop this illegal immigration into the U.S., which will inevitably put Mexican military and security forces in direct conflict with the Mexican drug cartels, which is an interesting situation. Will this increase manufacturing in the U.S.? Yeah, to a certain extent. I think it will. And I think the investment/divestment issue will be a thing. What I do see as a kind of a wild card is what role will Elon Musk play with China? He has an enormous investment, enormous manufacturing stake in China. And so I'm kind of wondering he's obviously extremely influential with President Trump, so I'm not quite sure where that's going to go. What should we see from Mexico's president? Well, I imagine, Claudia Sheinbaum Pardo will. Right now, you're seeing a lot of very strong anti-Trump administration policy rhetoric, if you will. And I think for internal political reasons, she's going to try and maintain that to a certain extent. But I think in substantive stuff, when they start seeing the full impact of this, you're going to see and I think that's probably why this is as strong as it is to force Mexico to do something politically that it absolutely does not want to do. So that's part of that. In the U.S., we're seeing mass deportations. They've leveraged the military to fly large military aircraft to take undocumented illegal aliens back. The priority is to get illegal criminal aliens back to wherever they came from. So we're seeing that happening. We've got currently about 2,500 troops on the border, some federal, some state, although I do imagine at some point that a number of the border states are going to try and move them into some sort of federal status. There's limitations of what federal troops can do, what state troops don't. If they're state funded under state authority, under the governor, those military troops can actually do things like law enforcement. They could actually arrest people, theoretically. And federal troops can't do that. It's actually a violation of federal law. They'd have to change the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878 in order to have federal troops do military stuff. But federal troops can do a lot of things. They can provide logistics. They can provide reconnaissance, surveillance on the border. That could be on the ground. That could be in the air. It could be using advanced sensor systems. They can provide command and control. They can do a lot of interesting things, communications, a lot of stuff that frees up Border Patrol and other law enforcement agencies to do more without tying up their resources, doing some of these logistics things. And one thing the military does really well is it sets up camps. And so when President Trump talks about setting up a camp in Gitmo, which, by the way, it won't be the existing little prison that's down there. He's talking about doing something that harkens back to the 90s when we had Haitians and down there in mass, building these mass tent cities and stuff. That's what he's really talking about. But when you're talking about stuff like that, that's where the military can actually come in and play a big role. Can the border eventually be secure? I don't know. I do think they're going to start rebuilding that wall. I think there's going to be a lot going on there. I do think that we're going to get Mexico to do a lot more on their side to stop aliens and also to prevent drug smuggling or try to curtail drug smuggling coming in across the border. Although I do talk about the toothpaste tube analogy, that if you squeeze hard in one sector, they tend to go to another sector. So if we see the border get hardened, I'm anticipating we're going to see a lot more maritime smuggling of drugs into the U.S. because the demand for this is what it is. So where will this all go? Well, we're going to find out, but I will tell you, it's been a big week. There's a lot of considerations that go into this. I think it's going to be a rather interesting next couple of weeks to see what happens with Canada, with Mexico, and watching what China does with all these things as well. There's just a lot of things going on, and I'm really kind of curious what's going to happen with Venezuela. that was actually, of all the countries down there to work with, Venezuela was going to be one of the toughest countries because of their virulent anti-U.S. stance. And now we've got them to do something that I frankly, if you'd asked me in the middle of last week if they could have pulled this off, I would have scratched my head and say, I don't know. I don't think so. And they did. And I'm kind of wondering what other deals may have been made quietly that they're not talking about. It's very possible. They say there aren't, but I don't know how those discussions went. Something there. So anyway, with all that said, hey, if you want to see my news interviews, go to Hal Kempfer TV on YouTube. That's Hal Kempfer TV. It's a YouTube channel, and I post all of my news interviews from, well, I was just on News Nation this morning, but certainly from Live Now by Fox and various other local stations, whether they're Fox, CBS, whomever, independent stations, things like that. So I post that there. And hopefully you'll get a chance to enjoy some of those. Although you do want to catch them since it's news, you want to catch them contemporaneously because, well, frankly, old news is old news. So anyway, thanks, and looking forward to your next sojourn with me into discussing strategic risk assessment, looking across the globe.